most beneficent, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all very much for inviting me and for being here at the start of a holiday. You must all be wanting to rush off and do things with your families. You're all very, very lucky, I've already been saying, because I come from the frozen north in Yorkshire, and we are every day on my email I get fantastic lectures that are going on here, fantastic lectures that the City Circle are doing, and there's only so much time I can spend on a train coming down to London, so you're very blessed by the kind of thing, and particularly what you have here with the Dialogue Society. My talk to you isn't pleasant. There are some very unpleasant truths which I think that we have to face up to. I'm on a daily learning curve, and I will very much enjoy hearing from you and being challenged by you as to the conclusions at this point that I have reached, because, as I say, it's an ongoing process. A lot of my talk will concentrate on the UK and what's happening to Muslim families here. In London, you have a kind of a very mixed community, obviously Muslims from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from Turkey, whatever. Outside London, the Muslim community tends to be much more uniform, and actually nationally, overwhelmingly, it is Pakistani. And of that group, overwhelmingly, it is from Azad Kashmir or Bangladesh, if it are Sylheti groups. If you look at the numbers, that's where they're from. Those are the groups. They are the majority, and they are the groups in the north, obviously, in Bradford, in Sheffield, where I live, in Blackburn, that I'm engaged with. So that's where my information comes from. I'm also a professor of law in Lahore in Pakistan, although at present, unfortunately, I'm not able to go there for security reasons, as the police officers that look after me presently can't look after themselves, as they tell me, which is a great sadness to me, because I'm working on gender and ethics there. I'm taking academics from here over to Pakistan to work on joint projects there, which presently I'm frozen from being able to do. So that's the community that I work with. I've also been to Saudi Arabia, and I'm working with women in Saudi Arabia. I've been to Istanbul to the World Conference of Women into Business International. I also work in Ethiopia. So I do know what's happening worldwide. And sadly, the picture of what's happening in Muslim families worldwide isn't a pretty one. I'm part of the Pan-European campaign against forced marriage under Professor Tariq Ramadan. We had our launch in 2008 in Rotterdam. People came from, I think, 9 European countries. And the issues that I'm talking about today, although their communities are obviously different, dependent on where they came from, they may be Turkish, Moroccan, whatever, the same problems I'm facing here in Sheffield, in Blackburn, in Luton, were happening there as well. The same way I work with Professor Sylvia Mayer at New York University, the same issues they're facing within our communities there, particularly not so much the African Caribbean Muslim community and the white community, but also with their recently immigrated communities. Sadly, a middle class, quite famous, I think they're into the media, Muslim family only a couple of weeks ago, he beheaded his wife, which gave a great image. But it was right across all the media in America, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Handsome made a brilliant speech against these sorts of issues, which you can pick up on YouTube. And that's why if you hear Sheikh Hamza's speech, he doesn't actually mention the case, but that's why Sheikh Hamza felt called upon to do this. So those issues, I can tell you, go across the globe and go across Europe, although I'm going to concentrate obviously in where I work and what I'm dealing with and what constitutes actually the majority in this country. It is a matter of shame for me. My friend Jasvinda Sanghera, who you may have heard of, she has written 2 books, one called Shame and one called Daughters of Shame, because what happens if you are a girl who chooses to escape a forced marriage or to leave it after you've been put into it, she's a Sikh, whether you are Sikh, Muslim, whatever, you are the one that brings shame on your family. You damage the family's Izzat. You are the outcast, regardless of how your age or what has happened to you. And as she was told by her mother, every time she would phone her after she left, you are dead, you will be nothing, you are in the gutter, you will never come to anything. I have to try not to get upset now, because last week she was with the women who met at number 10 Downing Street with Mrs. Obama, and she was invited to that, and I hope her mother can see that far from bringing shame on her family, she's brought so much respect, although I doubt that is how they will see it at all, because she's still spat at in the street in Derby on an almost monthly basis by her family, and is shortly to leave there because it's all got too much. And I have sat and listened to the victims from all the communities who have left forced marriage and honour crime situations, and how they feel the guilt, how they feel, how dare I have done this, and that guilt stays with them for the rest of their life. The same would be the case if you wanted to leave a domestic violence situation or whatever. Put up and shut up. What you must not do is bring shame on our families. That is the shame. The shame that we, as a community who should be the best of communities, who have a fantastic guide, both within the Quran and in particular by the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and by the Lady Khadijah, by Aisha, look at their lives and look at how they reflect in the life that so many Muslim women in this country and worldwide are forced to live today. There would be no correlation between them whatsoever. You know, all the blokes that like to wear the trousers halfway up the legs because they're following the Prophet. Strange they don't follow it when it comes to the really serious things about how he brought up, how he looked after his children, his grandchildren and his wives, and how he treated women generally. Very strange that they forget the actual vital important things, but the outside things matter. And the shame to me, who came to Islam through people like my friend, my teacher Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Handsome, Peter Hassan, and saw this wonderful spiritual warm religion that I felt so drawn to. They bring shame on me by their behaviour towards women and children. And the dysfunctional family life that I see all about me that is hidden. They bring shame on the religion, they bring shame on the Prophet, peace be upon him, and above all they bring shame on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's where the shame should lie, not the girls who seek to escape from violence. As you heard, I've been working at a grassroots and policy level, nationally and internationally, for 13 years now. Originally just in the general field of domestic violence. I was until last month leading on domestic violence nationally for the Family Justice Council, sitting on APCO committees, and I also chair the Intergovernmental Raising the Standards initiative. In the last 6 years, I've developed a specialist interest in understanding and tackling abuse in the UK, Asian, and in particular Muslim communities. And I'm doing this from an Islamic perspective. I've engaged widely with police, CPS, other professionals, and most importantly the NGOs in the UK and in a number of Muslim countries, including, as I said, Saudi Arabia, and so far 6 trips to Pakistan. I seek to assist with the gender sensitization programs, and I've learned from their experience in order to gain a greater understanding of the dynamics governing the behaviour of UK immigrants from these countries. I've also set up in Yorkshire a professional Muslim women's network, which now has over 100 members, and to which Sheikh Hamza, much to the jealousy of our men, came and addressed last year. We already got one over on them there. Wherever I've gone in the UK or overseas, I've had the privilege of meeting many strong, highly motivated women, from housewives to activists to princesses. They have proved the opposite of the stereotypical image of Muslim females. They are fully motivated and cognizant of the problems and attitudes which hold back the advancement of women in their societies, and the unhelpful, abusive family and marital practices and attitudes. They all seek to bring about change, aided by many men of goodwill that I have also come across. They are hampered and frustrated by the pace at which their society is able to change, and the fear of ostracism and outright attack, and frequently death threats from their communities for highlighting such issues. The Minister for Women's Development of Punjab was assassinated last year, as have been many female teachers and NGOs in Northwest Province. In fact, 3 NGOs were only killed last week. In the UK, I'm patron of Carmony Ivana, which is the leading Asian women's organisation assisting abused women. It runs the national helpline. The death threats that Jasvinder has received, together with Shahid Taj MD, who runs Muslim Women's Charity in Cardiff, they are the norm. Unfortunately, the UK government has until recently been slow to engage women from the affected communities, particularly in the so-called war against terror. The post-7/7 committees were, I believe, too hastily convened with little thought and made up to an unfortunate degree of the so-called self-serving and self-appointed male community leaders. A major opportunity for change was lost at a vital time. The Department of Communities is now seeking to make amends, engaging with this group, for instance, and inter alia, having set up Muslim women's and youth groups. Too little, too late. Many of our politicians at a local and national level are well aware of the family issues that I'm talking about, and other abuses such as electoral fraud, child abuse in mosques, etc., etc. But to their shame, other than a few brave souls such as Anne Cryer MP, McKeithley, they have kept silent due to fear of losing the Muslim vote in their constituencies or of appearing racist, Islamophobic. Many of the men, and sadly some women of our communities of all ages, asked to verify the matters that I set out below. They will deny, minimise and attack. It's interesting when you go to conferences all over the country on forced marriage, Stoke, Bradford, wherever, always some councillor stands up and says, this is a terrible problem, but it doesn't happen here. The best one was in Manchester, where there's a very nice middle-class mosque houses of Bowden. It does happen, but not in mosques like ours. It's always somewhere else that it's happening, which I do find fascinating. They do this denial for a variety of reasons, some akin to people still believing that 9/11 and 7/7 were not perpetrated by Muslims, but by the Jews or security forces. But prominent amongst this denial is the public face of the concept of Izzat or honour, that so badly affects private family life that at all costs the image of the community and the family must be protected. Secondly, the community leaders, these male communities, are often the main beneficiaries of this, and they gain their power and influence, and in some cases wealth, from the current patriarchal feudal system that I describe, and they are unlikely to want it changing. Would a Roman or a United States slave owner voluntarily free their slaves? I believe I've been able to gain the confidence of the women and professionals working to counter these abuses, and therefore to elicit otherwise well-hidden information as another woman and myself a Muslim. Obviously I will concentrate in this talk on the extreme end, the murders, the forced marriage, the extreme domestic violence. But what I want you to actually imagine, the thing that really saddens me, is in so many of the families that I deal with, the normal families, little boys and girls grow up with a mum and dad who never have and never will love each other, who have been taught intergenerationally not to show any affection between parents, never to hear mum and dad say to each other, I love you, or put their arm around each other while they're watching the TV, or hold their hand in the house. I'm not talking about public displays. Never just to see them laughing and joking together. Never to even say to the kids themselves, I love you, we love you, because they don't know how to do it. And because it's not only their own mum and dad, but it's all the cousins and aunties and uncles behaving exactly the same way. So there is just none of that ordinary concept at the ordinary level of what love and affection is, and how far is that removed from what we know Islam should be, and what, again I say, the life of the Prophet and his family life would have been. And it's so sad that I'm talking about millions of families not having that knowledge and not even understanding what you're talking about. This is the extreme end, but that's what I want you to have in the back of your mind all the time, that we need to propose. I don't propose, other than tentatively, to offer any firm conclusions in this speech. Rather, I'm seeking to initiate debate as to what may be the contribution to the terrible situation that we're in, that has already been outlined at the bottom of every league table as Muslims, for health, education, social advancement, etc. The highest levels of all, the ill health, the highest levels of people on benefits, etc., etc. And also, what is the contribution to radicalisation in the UK? Not obviously the only issue, but one of the factors, I call it the missing piece of the jigsaw of radicalisation, of the widespread abuse of women, children, and dysfunctional and unhappy family life, and ill-matched marriages, and to explore what professional partnerships should be formed, and what further research and policy development should take place. What are the connections between between distorted conceptions of Izzat in private life and radicalisation. I'm on the continual learning curve, and there are amazing professionals and NGOs and academics that I consider our government, the defence, the intelligence communities, and we should be engaging and learning from in their research. I would include, for instance, Professor Shaheen Ali, the former Minister for Women's Development in Pakistan, and Professor Shirin Ray, they're both at Warwick. Dr. Pervez Moody at Cambridge University, many professors at SOAS. When I sat down with these girls and I said to them, have the government ever called any of you in? Not one. Pathetic. I lecture once a year on understanding Islam in the 21st century that they hold at the Army University at Cranfield. For 2 years running, I've been the only woman speaking, the only Muslim woman, because I'm white. You know, why are none of these women ever brought in? They're the real experts, you know, because they're trampled over often by the men who say, you know, they don't even exist. So, but it's the government also to go out to them. You know, they're not hidden away, and they write those wonderful papers and should be engaged to do even more. There is abused, dysfunctional family life in all our societies. In the general UK population, 1 in 4 women suffer domestic violence at some time in their lives. And there is now, I've crossed out 50%, because my son, who's a law student, tells me it's now 60% divorce rate, leading to a well-researched myriad of social problems. As a family judge, I deal daily, including today, with appalling child and female abuse in the general population. One only has to look at Baby P and Megan Matthews. Megan Matthews obviously occurring in my area. She's actually fostered very close to my home. But what do we know of the effect of the particular forms of extreme patriarchy and denigration of women and the abuse of power, which I outline below, which occur within many UK and other Muslim families and communities? We know, for instance, that Muslim men should constitute 2% of the present prison population, given their numbers. But actually, they're overrepresented by 5 times, being 10%. Most are incarcerated not for terrorist offences, but for offences and drugs and violence. Why are they so overrepresented? We know now that kids who are victims of domestic violence are most likely to end up in prison. Is there any correlation? 90% of prisoners have had family life with domestic violence. Is there any correlation between that figure of prisons? I have a friend, a wonderful imam at Doncaster prison, and he tells me exactly what the situation is. Why are our Muslim communities so failing in all the indices of education, achievement, health, and economic advance? For that, I would advise you to see the Muslim Youth Helpline report of 2007. Why is the rate of mental illness and suicide 3 times higher in UK Muslim women? Is this the flip side of the coin, which also leads to radicalisation? And are all these failures underpinned by the disempowerment, oppression of women, and abusive and unsuccessful family life? Western culture, and I'm not saying this is all right, applauds and supports the pursuit of egocentric individual happiness, choice and fulfilment, which could, of course, lead to a banking crisis. In contrast, the societies from which many of our Muslim communities arrive are sociocentric, feudal and communist. The individual is trained and groomed from birth to accept a strict hierarchical power structure which is not to be questioned, and where the perceived advancement and honour of the family Baradari community overrides that of the individual. The Muslim Health Youth Eye report states, obedience and duty are prominent themes which connect people to collectives and communities, and hence change at an individual level is less acceptable and or hazardous, frequently leading to feelings of guilt and shame. Underlying these cultural orientations are religious beliefs, which for so many become fused with culture and become difficult to change, even when the ethical purpose behind them becomes distorted. This is, I suggest, overwhelmingly a class of culture. Islam is the cure, not the cause. It is not religion, but it causes an internal psychological crisis of identity in 2nd and 3rd generation immigrants, which in conjunction with all the other factors, such as foreign policy, failing mosques, lack of Islamic education, racism, etc., etc., can lead to an apparent relief and a finding of identity in radical Islamism. Note, white Muslims and United States, African, Caribbean Muslims not having such cultural practices or identity issues do do not suffer from the particular forms of abuse plaguing the other communities. In contrast, Christian, Sikh and Hindu communities from those cultures suffer exactly the same issues. These attitudes and abuses are not only not condoned by Islam, but in fact are openly condemned by many contemporary authoritative scholars, such as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hansen, but they are cultural rather than religious in origin, although confused and excused because so many Muslims themselves have so little understanding of their own religion. It breaks my heart that tens of thousands of our little boys and girls spend 10 hours a week in mosques from the age of 5 to 18 and they know nothing about their religion. I was educated by Catholic nuns, and I can tell you by the time I left at 18 I knew all that I needed to know, but all they learn, often not obviously anything connected with this society, is the Quran off by heart, beginning, end, middle, end. They know nothing, because I question teenagers, they know nothing even about the Prophet, peace be upon him, nothing about the wonderful history, about how we were in Iraq with the fabulous universities in southern Spain, about Muslim civilization in terms of science or art or everything. Nothing. Is it any wonder that they have no sense of their own religion or their own identity? And the only people that are blamed for this are us, and it is for us to take this into our hands and do something about it. This is not a matter that can be blamed on the government. Although many of the forms of familiar abuse and marriage practices are also prevalent, as I say, in Hindu and Sikh communities, there are additional factors impacting on Muslims, a lot of which are set out in Dr. Phil Lewis's book, Young British and Muslim, in which he investigates the difference in the social, education and economic development and integration of 3 UK Asian communities. Amongst other issues, he highlights the differing marriage practices as having a vital role. In contrast to East African Muslim, Hindu and Sikh communities, who now largely marry aspirationally and within the UK, the Pakistani and in particular Mirpuri communities continue in numbers up to 70% as of this year to practice transnational cousin marriage. There is a new series, you may have heard some of it on Radio 4, they're doing a huge longitudinal study of babies born in Bradford 2000. I think it's going to carry on for about 20 years. It's called Born in Bradford. And Radio 4 did an hour programme on the first year of it last week. Now the reason it's called that they're doing this is because it has the highest rate of baby death in the country by far. Bradford has it's off the scale. They have 5 times the rate of genetic defects of all kinds. So they're going to study. There's also a huge issue with their poor white community in Bradford. Somebody said to me recently, a counsellor from Bradford, they're not suffering white flight in Bradford, they're suffering class flight. So people of all communities and races who become middle class are leaving, and what's left in the middle is a huge well of poverty of both. And so they're looking at both sides of this. But the overwhelming thing is the reason this piece of work's been done is the massive effect of lacking maternal health, transcontinental, particularly cousin marriage, leading to massive amounts of ill health. If what they showed from last year, the babies born in Bradford to Asian women, 70% were still last year born as a result of transcontinental cousin marriage. So people say things are changing, well, not that much. If one member of a marriage comes from an area such as Mirpur, still with 90% illiteracy, how compatible are they going to be with a Western-born and educated partner? How is such a person able to assist or wish their children to be educated to integrate? If the father is the recent unskilled, possibly illiterate immigrant, does that hold back the family economically in a consumerist society? And are his attitudes likely to be those of a very few rigid way of life that doesn't work in the UK? If the mother is the immigrant, is she able to assist the children with their schoolwork? We all know how many hours we all spend on their projects, as I did even today. And he's doing his finals now and he's still got mommy helping. Will she ever be able to help economically to support the family in a society largely based on 2-income households? How able are such disempowered mothers to act effectively if their children are falling into criminality or radicalisation? What kind of modern, relevant Islamic education is likely to be provided in such homes and to be provided and demanded by them in the mosques? What is the effect of the incidence of forced marriage and honour-based violence is the pressure to marry within the family and the value of the UK passport? And how much more difficult, if not impossible, is it to leave an unhappy cousin marriage with the fallout that will occasion? I see that fallout in my court, week in, week out. Basically murder, or just below it, within families because of this connection. We're now identifying 15,000 forced marriages a year in this country. 15,000. That's the official stats from where the reports are. 5,000 calls just to the forced marriage unit alone. The National Helpline in its first 10 months had 10,600, and that's not counting schools, social services, police. What we do need to get the proper statistic is a kind of snapshot that Betsy Stanko did in 2000 nationally on domestic violence, and we need to have that. But in any event, officially, and this is come out of nothing, 15,000. That's 15,000 miserable families. 15,000 lots of poor little kids living in those miserable families, and that's just that alone. During the last 10 years, we have in the UK and other first world countries begun to recognise new forms of abuse, primarily forms of domestic violence originating primarily in the developing world, having at their core the abuse of power and control, primarily through the abuse of patriarchy and the internationally accepted title honour-based violence. I've had hours of discussion about calling it that because, of course, honour has nothing to do with it, but because that's what the UN calls it, and that's what it's called in the countries where it originates. It's a language we need to use. We call it non-honour, but that's the reality. So I've had those discussions. These forms of abuse have been spread to and are being increasingly carried out in Western countries as a result of mass immigration. I think in Turkey, is it 10,000 a year they're reckoning on base murders now, particularly in Kurdistan? I did actually work with a whole group of Kurdish Iraqis that they brought to Pakistan, one of them here, for us to do training with, and they recognised that there were 12,000 reported honour crimes in Kurdistan a year. 12,000 deaths. I think there's reported in Sindh province alone 3,000 deaths, most of them reported. Prosecutions and convictions? No. The recognition and firm response by legal and governmental agencies has come late, in part due to misguided political correctness and the fear of being labelled as racist and Islamophobic, to the detriment and indeed the death of victims. The increasing education of and demands of women to make choices in their own lives, both here and in the developing world, has led, if anything, to an increase in honour violence as cultural and familiar expectations come into direct conflict with emancipation and individualisation. And behind the whole of this is honour. The honour of the family being seen to rest in the control of family members, and in particular, but not exclusively, through the sexuality and marital choices of its women. Although men are to a far greater extent victims of this than other forms of domestic violence, the recognised rate for forced marriage, for instance, in the UK is 15% of victims being male, but we know that that's a vast underestimate. 30% of victims are minors. Individual choice and human rights, such as the right to choose a spouse or to escape an abusive relationship, both of which fully in being with Islam, are subsumed and ignored, and seems a threat to the far more important group honour, which at all times must be protected and avenged, even at the cost of rejection, violence towards and murder of previously loved family members. We don't even know the full rates of the killings. And I always say, for every woman that's killed, 1,000 more live in fear, particularly if the victims, perpetrators are never brought to justice, as would happen in most cases, because they know what will happen to them if they step out of line, because it's the fools that kill them here. Or if you come from Iraqi Kurdistan, you can't take them back there to get killed. So like Banaz, you'll kill them here. Because the easy way to get rid of you is to send you back on a holiday to Sylhet or to Nepal, where you will just disappear, where somebody will kill you for either nothing or £5. So, you'd have to be an idiot to do it here. So how many unknown dead bodies. We actually haven't been taken back there. We just don't know, because I know from the women's organisations that I'm a patron of, their despair of the number of women that they know are in danger, that are induced to go home on a holiday that they never hear of again. So, and the Metropolitan Police have also acknowledged that we don't have and can't get the accurate statistics. I was very proud to be part of the development of the new Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act, and that is designed to enforce the state's intolerance of families coercing their children to marry against their wishes and to preempt such marriages in the first place. It makes provision for protecting individuals against being forced to enter into marriage without their free will and consent, and it's actually working. Within the first 8 weeks, we'd had already 11 orders made nationally. I have spoken to the judge at Birmingham Court who did 5 within the first 8 weeks, of which sadly 2 out of the 5 were very severely disabled children. I could give you a whole other lecture on the dreadful situation of severely physically and mentally disabled children being forced into marriage for a whole variety of reasons. And of course, because of the consanguinity and because of the genetic defects, the numbers of those children available to be married off for a whole variety of reasons is growing all the time. The Forced Marriage Unit is doing wonderful work. It is actually, I think, at the forefront of Western government's responses, and people come from all over the world to see what they're doing. And as I say, in 2007, they already were handling 5,000 inquiries and 400 cases, of which 68% were from Pakistan, hence why I'm putting that emphasis, 15% from Bangladesh. They are on average repatriating 3 victims to Islamabad every week, and they're about to open up an office in Sylhet. That forced marriage and immigration are inextricably linked can be seen in Charles's work on Pakistani marriages in the UK. And that's why we have raised, the government have raised, it was very controversial, and a lot of the NGOs were against this. They've raised the age of sponsorship from 18 to 21, just to give the victims that bit of age and security where perhaps they can say no, finish their education, have that degree of independence. But people argue the other way, that they'll be taken abroad earlier and just left there. So we'll just have to see and keep it in review all the time. Now something you might think is quite controversial. Parties such as the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal have been calling for Sharia courts to be set up in the UK to tackle legal issues that reverberate, particularly amongst Muslim communities, such as domestic violence and forced marriage. Those are the things they are particularly advocating that they will be better able to deal with. At the time of writing, Sharia law has no jurisdiction in England and Wales, and the government has displayed no intention to change this position. Regardless of religious belief, we are all equal before the law of this country. This is a fundamental value of UK life. I believe any formal introduction or recognition of Sharia law, particularly Sharia family law, other than obviously granting the divorce, the religious divorce which is needed, and the same obviously happens within the Jewish courts and the Catholic courts for nullity, would at this stage be a retrograde step to be avoided at all costs. Firstly, I believe it would be a barrier to community harmony and integration. Secondly, it would be against the human rights laws and conventions to which the UK are signatories. We had a case of an Egyptian woman seeking asylum that went to the House of Lords last year, but the House of Lords made it clear that that they would not return her to Egypt because the Sharia law that she and her child would have to face there to do with the custody of the child would be automatically taken off her, was against all our human rights conventions. So this is why I'm so surprised that this issue should be raised. You know, I have met some of these self-appointed judges, and they have no knowledge of English law whatsoever, and I would question how much their knowledge would be of what we would want to regard as Sharia and what they would be applying. Muslim women, I believe, would be pressurised by their families and communities not to avail themselves of the rights and protection afforded to them as UK citizens, including in dealing with forced marriage. I therefore wonder and question the wisdom of being discussed, least of all by the Chief Justice and the Archbishop of Canterbury, because I believe I know it is offered hope to the fundamentalists and separatists of their aims being met. Finally, there is the question of where do we stop? Because you can't have one set of laws for this religion and one set for another. Because, for instance, if we have a different set of laws that we all operate under for every religion, do we have one for Satanists? Can they operate under their own religious precepts? We would have anarchy. We can't obviously, however, prevent individuals from seeking to regulate their lives through their religious beliefs or cultural traditions. Communities and other groups have the option to use religious councils or any other system of alternative dispute resolution and to agree themselves to abide by those decisions. That said, I do not believe we should be encouraging or endorsing any departure from UK secular law for any section of our community, least of all our most vulnerable. And what Sharia law are we going to have? Is it going to be Sunni? Is it going to be Ismaili? Is it going to be which section of Sunni? Is it going to be Sufi? And you know, who's going to regulate all this? Who's going to accredit it? What qualifications will these judges have to have? Chaos. We're not in the situation that you would be in a Muslim state, like in Pakistan, where they have their proper structure, where they go through all the normal systems. That isn't going to happen. And I'm not saying in some ideal state should, in the future, Sharia law possibly apply. Possibly it should, but that would not be the situation that we'd be having now. We'd be having chaos, we'd be having anarchy, and we'd have women's rights completely subsumed by people who really, quite frankly, wouldn't know what they were doing. How much does the same concept of Izzat, which I suggest so governs the lives of UK Muslim and Asian communities, and in particular the young men, who feel themselves derided and dismissed, lead also to an individual and group desire to avenge what is seen as Western and infidel attacks nationally and internationally on Muslims and Islam and their honour, and which they revenge through acts of terrorism, which is then supported and covered up by their families and communities acting under the same precepts. My dear friend Nazir Afzal, the Crown Prosecution Service's Director for West London, has asserted that Islamic extremists are igniting the spread of honour-based violence amongst women in Britain. He happens to do both sides of the divide. Part of his work is dealing with counter-terrorism, and the other half, which is the part that is his heart, is dealing with the honour crimes and forced marriage. And of course, in doing that, he's seen the connections. He has emphasised the instances where women overseas have been compelled to become suicide bombers after being accused of bringing shame onto their families. That has particularly happened in Palestine. He's added that Muslim faith that justifies aggression and violence is now diffusing into Britain as well. And he estimates that there have been nearly a dozen killings in Britain each year, and has articulated his distress over the escalating problem. Talking about the religious ideology, he stated that men are using Islam as a justification for telling women how to behave and for punishing them. At the London Voluntary Services Council conference, he said such a use of Islam to support violence towards women is a grossly mistaken interpretation of our religion. It is simply outdated. It is about power and control over women and not religion. And that the rise in religious conservatism, particularly amongst young men, was fueling militancy and had also brought about an increase in honour crime. Radicalisation and extremism are about identity. It is about people clinging to outdated customs to give them identity. There is no religious justification for any of this. There is nothing in any Quranic text or any South Asian religion that justifies or excuses this type of crime. They will use religion. They will use culture. They will use, this is the way things happen back home. They will use any number of excuses, but ultimately it comes down to simple male power. This abuse is not only not condemned by the wider community here and abroad, but can be applauded, resulting in the protection of perpetrators, including by the police and the courts in the countries of origin, and the hounding down of victims by vigilantes paid and unpaid. In countries such as Pakistan and Bangladesh, in the very unlikely event a prosecution would ever take place and a conviction ensue, sentence would be non-existent or vastly reduced due to the accepted mitigation of honour. Many potential and active victims and perpetrators in the UK misguidedly believe that a similar response of the police and the courts will pertain here, and they act accordingly. In countries with high prevalence, Izzat governs every aspect and hour of life, and the deeply ingrained attitudes of entire societies will have to be altered no easy task. Such interpretation was affirmed at the Foreign Office International Comment on Honour Killings in Karachi in November 2005. But it has never been more ably or graphically described than in the judgment of Lord Justice Wall on the 16th of March 2009. For those of you who are lawyers, it's a 2009 EWCA 2005. It's a case of AM against the local authority. It is a horror story. If you read it, you could not believe what has gone on. And when I read it, they've had to give anonymity to all the witnesses, to the CAFCAS officer, to the psychologist, to the experts, because of death threats to all of them. The lawyers were under police protection because of death threats to them. And when I read it, and I just couldn't believe the horror in it, I thought, wait a minute, one of these experts who I happen to know has told me of a similar case. I must have got them mixed up, so I phoned said expert, if I say the sex it will be obvious, and was told, no, there's an identical case going on in Liverpool at exactly the same time. So read it. It's 26 pages long, but unbelievable. The Lord Justice Wall, who is my mentor and my hero, says, the message from this case, which must be sent out loud and clear, is that this court applies a tolerant and human rights-based rule of law, one which under the Act of 1989 regards parents as equals and the welfare of the child as paramount. That is the law of England, and that is the law which applies in this case. Arson, domestic violence and potential revenge likely to result in abduction or death are criminal acts which will be treated as such. In this case, the family may wish to reflect on the fact that it has lost 5 of its children, 1 by death, 1 by the legitimate flight from gender-based violence inflicted on his mother, and 3 to the care system. None of this, in my judgment, has anything to do with any concept of honour, and all of it is manifestly contrary to the best interests of children. What is life like for the children of such unions? We now have incontrovertible evidence from all leading psychiatrists, particularly Dr. Sturgeon Glaser, psychologists and criminologists, of the short and long-term effects of children of domestic violence, including increased criminality. But to date, insufficient research has been done on the effects of the distinct yet connected forms of abuse and dysfunctionality being carried out in our Asian and Muslim and other communities, and I suggest that the time has now come for it. What level of profiling of our known terrorists has there been in terms of their family backgrounds, and with what cultural understanding? Just saying that their parents or they were married and are not divorced is irrelevant in a community where the ending of utterly miserable marriages is so difficult, if not impossible, and in which what were the expectations of growth and happiness, mutual support, not to mention love through marriage, is often so very low. There are also many hidden practices, well known within the communities, but successfully hidden from outsiders. They include polygamy, of which I believe there are tens of thousands of examples in the UK. Practiced for a variety of reasons, but I increasingly see, including westernised Asian men, who were forced or groomed into a first marriage arranged by the family, but from which they are unable to escape, then entering into a second love marriage, an arrangement overwhelmingly unsatisfactory to all parties and their children. In the last 3 weeks, I've heard of a senior bank manager in Bradford like this, a senior police officer in Bradford, and a senior police officer in South Yorkshire where I am. That's in 3 weeks, living in such arrangements. So do not tell me that they are rare. There is also the growing phenomena of limping marriages and abandoned wives, either in this country or back home, which is where the poor girl is just left in a terraced house in Bradford on her own with the kids while he's never there, physically or in any other way, or she's just sent back home and abandoned there. And you wonder why we have the rate of suicide, because that's their only way out of an utterly miserable situation. She may only be 17 or 18. I also have great sympathy for the men of our communities. They have to suffer huge issues of racism, economic deprivation and lack of status. They are confused and at a loss as to what their role as husbands and fathers should be. Their role models, fathers and wider family, have a set of values and approach to life that they feel obliged to follow, but which they question, at the same time having little or no idea of a modern Islamic alternative. Many live double lives, and there won't be one of us here that doesn't know one of them living a double life, wrapped by guilt and unhappiness for all concerned. I'm not going to go into it now. There's a whole issue with Islamism, forced marriage and liberation theology, where basically Islamists need to tell girls, in particular at university, join us because we allow you to marry if you want to. There's a lot of work going on in that way. In conclusion, I hope I convinced you of the need for further investigation of the possible links between dysfunctional family lives of so many in the communities, Muslim communities, and them being also communities in which radical terrorists are emerging, and the radicalisation of the young people. What kind of happy family life and upbringing could Mr. Bin Laden himself have enjoyed, regardless of his wealth, as one of so very many children, and with a father who had legions of wives and concubines, having, as I heard in Saudi Arabia, a particular penchant for village Bedouin girls, and with what effect on his later emotional development. I suggest as ways forward that it's our duty as Muslims, and in particular as the educated class, to put a stop to this shame on Islam, a shame on our religion. And some things that I would suggest are working towards the empowerment of and true engagement with women, the fearless enforcement of laws and protocols relating to child abuse, domestic abuse, honour-based violence and forced marriage in the affected communities, media campaigns. My particular favourite, a nationwide professional Muslim family counselling service that families can go to, with people who are good Muslims, with good knowledge of their religion, but also know Western psychology and counselling techniques. So you can go with your kid who's got a drug problem, your granny that's driving you mad with problems within your marriage, somewhere where you're going to have proper professional advice, but also where you feel safe, both in a religious sense and in a cultural sense. Training on a multi-agency basis, research, programs on healthy relationships within schools and also in outreach services and the mosque. But above all, true Muslim education, so that true Muslim values are yet again known to our communities and to our families. And we are once again what we ought to be, the best of communities, the best of families. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hanson said at the Albert Hall a few years ago that we had a prophet that dreamed big dreams, and he did. These problems are huge. Sometimes I can tell you I feel totally overwhelmed by them. But I'm guided by the fact that slavery, apartheid, which at one time seemed totally intractable, have been overcome. By the fact that we have a black president of the United States. And by the fact that we had, above all, a prophet who'd dreamed big dreams and brought it about. And I think we can do it if we've got the will and the power and wish to do so. Thank you very much.